The British justice system is the envy of the world. But in the past, mistakes have been made.
Over the last 150 years, approximately 1,500 people have been hanged in the United Kingdom. Many of those desperately protested their innocence.
Some of these long-standing convictions could be a miscarriage of justice.
The evidence is so overwhelming that they have to tell the truth.
In this series, a living relative will attempt to clear their family name.
He was a good man, and his last thoughts were for his family.
Searching for new evidence.
There's a certain type of stain that we might expect to see called impact spatter.
With help from two of the UK's leading barristers, one for the defence.
There is a world of difference between an unpleasant journey and murder.
And one for the prosecution.
He cut off her head, dismembered her, and buried her in a place where he hoped she would never be found.
They're on a mission to solve a mystery, submitting their findings to a Crown Court judge.
Your Honour ought to declare the conviction for murder to be unsafe.
Thank you both for your submissions. I shall consider these matters for myself.
Can this modern investigation rewrite history? On a wet Saturday night in February 1884, in the coal mining village of Buttonall, County Durham, Police Sergeant William Smith was doing his rounds. Suddenly, a group of men emerged from the dark, and he was brutally attacked with stones, kicks, and punches. The assault was so severe that his skull was fractured, and he was left for dead in the road. Two passing doctors went to the wounded sergeant's aid, and he was carried home. But a couple of hours later, he died from his horrific injuries. Suspicion soon fell on three local miners who'd been out drinking in Buttonall that evening. 25-year-old Joseph Lowson, his brother-in-law William Siddle, and friend Joseph Hodgson. They were arrested for the policeman's murder and stood trial at the Durham Assizes. Hodgson was acquitted by the jury, but Lowson and Siddle were both found guilty and sentenced to death. At the last minute, Siddle was reprieved, and on the 27th of May 1884, Joseph Lowson alone was hanged. Now, more than a century later, Joseph Lowson's great-great-nephew Peter and his wife Diane are seeking justice.
Joseph Lowson's niece, Ethel,
Ethel, that's right, that's my grandmother.
is your grandmother.
But I never met her because she was dead a long, long time before I come along.
I started to do family history on Peter's side. He said, oh, we had a relative that was hanged, and I was sort of gobsmacked, really.
Peter first learned about the case from his father.
He was told about this from a very young age, and by people who knew Joseph as well. My dad said, it's not what you think, Peter. It's far more depth than it looks.
Many members of Peter's family worked as miners.
This is your grandfather, isn't it?
Just look at what they used to have to work in. No helmets or nothing.
And no showers at the
No, they never had anything like that. He used to wash in cold water. They lived hard lives. They were hard men, you know, but they were good men and good people. And to say one of them would have deliberately stoned someone to death, it doesn't add up.
Peter and Diane have doubts that Joseph Lowson was guilty of murder and are keen to clear his name.
If it was to be found that it was an unsafe conviction, I would feel a weight lifted in many respects. I know my father and all my relations and all the people at that time have been dead a long, long time. But it's still my family. It doesn't matter how long ago they lived, and I care about that.
The case against Joseph Lowson was circumstantial and included contentious identification evidence. But was it a miscarriage of justice? And can a modern-day legal team shed any fresh light on this Victorian-era conviction? Examining the case for the defence is Jeremy Dean QC, who has defended clients in some of the country's most high-profile trials. And for the prosecution is Sasha Wass QC, who successfully prosecuted some of the UK's most notorious criminals. Peter and Diane have come to London to meet the barristers.
Hello, Diane.
Hello, Jeremy.
Good to meet you.
Hi.
How did you first find out about the case?
My father told me, well, a long time ago. I suppose I'd have been in my early teens, and he was quite upset when he was telling me.
Does the fact that Joseph Lawson was the only one to be hanged for this crime, is that something that motivates you even more to seek justice for him?
Yes, because why should he be the only one?
It seems strange. I'd never known that before.
Well, we'll have to look into that. I agree with you. It is strange.
You know, generally, if one gets, it's all, isn't it? Pretty well.
Let me just ask you one question. I mean, sometimes in the course of this sort of investigation, it turns out that the evidence was even stronger than it seemed at the time. If that was to be the case, how would you feel about that?
Well, I wouldn't be very pleased, really. I mean, I'd accept it because I've got to accept it.
It's been great meeting you. Thank you so much for coming.
Joseph Lawson was born in 1858 into a coal mining family, the eldest of 10 siblings. From the age of about 10, he began working in the mines, and his mother died when he was 14. Aged 19, he married the sister of his co-accused William Siddle, and they had 3 children together, including one born just a month before he was hanged. Lawson undoubtedly lived a hard life, but was he capable of murder? The barristers are starting their investigation by examining the facts of the case.
It was about 10 o'clock at night. Sergeant William Smith was doing his rounds. On that day, there'd been a pigeon shoot and people were in the Diamond Inn public house. Now, it's about 10:15. Dr. Middleton, with his assistant, Mr. Gorick, were walking up the hill, and Gorick saw a man who was claiming that a policeman had been killed. The doctor and his assistant looked into this and found the body of Sergeant Smith. He was still alive, but he had been very badly beaten and left for dead. Now, at this point, Dr. Middleton tried to chase the man who had given him the information about the injured officer. And 3 men at that stage emerged and pelted Dr. Middleton with bricks. Dr. Middleton ran towards Buttonole, raising the alarm, shouting murder. Sergeant Smith was taken to a house where he died 2 hours later. So the first line of the police inquiry was to go to the house of William Siddle. William Siddle had been accused the year before of assaulting Sergeant Smith. Siddle was at home in bed, and Joseph Hodgson was staying with him. Hodgson was asked who he had been with the previous evening, and Hodgson named Lawson. Police went to the house of Lawson and they retrieved a shirt which had a missing button. They inspected the crime scene where the attack had taken place and they found a button. So, Jeremy, what do you think?
Well, Sasha, this was undoubtedly a circumstantial case. The button that was found at the crime scene, the identification evidence. We need to look at all of that to assess how strong or weak the circumstances implicating Joseph Lawson were. What also troubles me is the fact that Joseph Lawson, as the only accused person to be hanged, is an aspect of this case that particularly interests me.
Okay.
135 years on from the murder, Joseph Lawson's great-great-nephew Peter and his wife Diane have come to Buttonole, where Sergeant Smith was killed.
If we look at the map, you see, you can see.
Exactly where it was, yeah.
And I think this is
The actual spot where it happened.
yeah, an arrow in the stone.
In the stone, that's right, yeah.
Pointing where the body was found.
They're keen to explore the sequence of events that unfolded on the night of the attack.
The brutal murder of a policeman. Sergeant Smith, the policeman, had been doing his rounds in the local pubs because they had to be closed at 10. And so he got to here, and evidently it's alleged that 3 men, Lawson, Siddle and Hodgson, attacked him.
Yes.
And leaving him dead in the gutter.
Yeah.
A few minutes later, Doctors Middleton and Gorick were coming up the hill. Dr. Middleton paused by the engine house, whilst Gorick went on and met a distressed man in the road who alerted him to the injured policeman.
Gorick found the policeman and he cradled him. Oh, and it's quite gruesome that his skull came away in his hands.
Yeah.
His left eye had been knocked in and all his teeth had been knocked out.
That's
quite a ferocious
attack, yeah.
attack,
Yeah,
wasn't
very,
it?
yeah, it is a ferocious attack.
Dr. Gorick went to fetch Dr. Middleton, who, upon seeing the sergeant's desperate condition, ran off in search of the man who had alerted Gorick to the attack. He encountered 3 men who pelted him with stones, and he retreated.
It was in February, it was raining,
Yeah,
it was pitch black,
it was.
and you wouldn't see anything. So how they identified who it was?
It's not as clear cut. I mean, there's a certain amount of truth, obviously, otherwise the poor fellow wouldn't have died, you know, and it's alleged my family were involved in that death. That is a very severe thing. There would have been a lot of ferocity involved in this attack.
Very sad.
It is sad for everybody, it's awful.
The attack on Sergeant Smith took place on the evening following a local pigeon shooting competition. After the match, dozens of men, including Lowson, Siddle and Hodgson, had gone for drinks in the Diamond Inn public house. With so many people out in the village that evening, did anyone notice anything suspicious? Jeremy and Sasha are examining some of the witness reports from the time.
Well, Sasha, this is the village of Butterknowle, which is where the killing of Sergeant Smith took place. And here we see the Diamond Inn, and this is where Lowson, Siddle and Hodgson were. There's a witness, John Lowson, not believed to be a relative of the defendant Lowson, who saw the group of 3 and said that they were snittering at Sergeant Smith, which presumably means launching some verbals. And then later, he overheard Siddle say, "Let's go back and rib the police," an important piece of evidence.
And we mustn't forget that Siddle had been accused of assaulting Sergeant Smith the year before, so there was clearly a history between those two.
Following in his relative's footsteps, Peter has come to the Diamond Inn with Diane to meet local historian Jeanette Newell.
Hello, Jeanette. How do you do? I'm Diane.
Can the events that unfolded here offer any further clues about whether Joseph Lowson was involved in the attack on the sergeant?
I have a photograph of the Diamond Inn at the time when Sergeant Smith was sadly murdered.
It's not changed a lot, has it?
It hasn't. No, we've got an additional porch now, but the outside is pretty much as it was. And at the time of the pigeon shoot, after that, there'll be between 60 and 70 men in here.
Really?
I would imagine most people are in here from about 5 o'clock onwards, because it will be too dark then in February to do any shooting of any sort. Yeah. And everybody that was leaving the pub would have been in here potentially for 5 hours consuming alcohol. So how reliable could they be as witnesses?
Typical, isn't it? Who's to say that it wasn't any one of these 60 or 70 men? You know, that's a very, very grey area. It could possibly have been someone else that had a grudge against Sergeant Smith.
And it was so dark.
It could have been anybody.
2 key witnesses on the evening of Sergeant Smith's murder were Doctors Middleton and Gorick. Dr. Middleton was pelted with stones by 3 men, who it was assumed had also been the ones to assault the policeman. But was the evidence of the doctors reliable?
Dr. Middleton was able to describe these men as one being very tall, one being of medium height, and one being short.
There's a clear basis for believing that both of them were under the influence of alcohol. According to Gorick, they'd had 4 or 5 glasses of beer and a couple of glasses of whiskey. And there's a witness by the name of Benjamin Smedley who said in relation to Middleton and Gorick, they were both the worse for liquor. The reliability of their evidence was very much an issue, and the quality of their description and identification testimony.
When the police arrested Joseph Lowson, they found some bloodstains on his clothes, which it was initially suggested could be pig's blood, and a shirt missing a button. At the crime scene, a button was retrieved with pieces of thread attached to it. It was claimed by the prosecution at trial that both the blood and button evidence connected Joseph Lawson to the attack on Sergeant Smith. But does that assessment stand up to modern-day scrutiny? The barristers are meeting forensic scientist Sophie Park from London South Bank University.
Hi, Sophie.
Right. Now, can you just help us? In 1884, was it possible with any accuracy to determine whether it was human blood or animal blood?
No, I don't believe it was. They could look at the types of cells that were present, but the morphology, the shape and the sizes of the cells are similar for both human and animal. So it's not really possible.
Right.
What the defendant Lawson claimed was that if it was human blood on his clothing, that it was attributable to his little girl falling down and cutting her lip. I mean, that by way of explanation for the blood staining couldn't be dismissed, could it?
It would depend on the patterns of the bloodstains, which we have no information about the actual nature of the bloodstains. Nowadays, we would use blood pattern analysis to interpret the stains. Given the nature of the attack here, there's a certain type of stain that we might expect to see called impact spatter. If we were to see that on the clothing, that's not what we would expect from a child with a cut lip.
That's very interesting. Can I then move on to the button? Because when they went to Lawson's house, they found a shirt missing a button, and the conclusion at trial was that it looked as if the button had been forcibly removed. Is that a conclusion that is safe to draw by today's standards, by looking at the fabric on the shirt?
Yes, I believe so. It's possible to look at the shirt itself and the fabric, the stretching of the fibres, the tearing of the fibres, and a conclusion of forcible removal can be achieved.
Very, very nice to meet you. Thank you very much indeed.
Sergeant William Smith was born in 1844. At the age of 23, he joined the police force, and by the time of his death, he had served for 16 years and was a respected member of the community. In stark contrast, Lawson, Siddle and Hodgson were pitmen of low social standing. Peter and Diane want to learn more about their lives and whether their class could have influenced the case against them.
Nice to meet you, Chris. Nice to meet you.
They're meeting local journalist Chris Lloyd, who's written about the case.
People in the area, what type of life did they live then?
They live in very small houses with outside toilets. They work incredibly long hours. It's only a generation before they've been living in serfs, really, in tied cottages. And when something goes wrong in the pit, they're all thrown out of their cottages and all their materials and their possessions are thrown out onto the street with them. And they're regarded as a kind of second-class labourers. It is a very harsh lifestyle.
Well, I've heard that if you were a pitman, you were... No. That was pretty well the lowest.
Yeah, and I think that really feeds into the way this case is regarded. It's clearly an outrageous case, the killing of a policeman, and they, therefore, to get whoever did it. And it's the way they were regarded, the mining people, is shown in one quote from the Darlington and Stockton Times. This is just printed after the murder. It says, "There ought to be few difficulties in running the criminals to earth. Buttonhole is not London. The means of escape from justice are few. Several arrests have already been made, but unless the police are tolerably certain that they have caught the bastards, there ought to be no hesitation whatsoever in placing every house in the entire district under strict surveillance." A very, very rude description and a very demeaning description, really.
I'd find that very insulting if someone said that to me.
Yeah.
Or if I read that, I'd find that insulting.
And you can see this kind of stratification of society all the way through this case, I think. And also, they feel that the whole community is somehow guilty.
Yeah, very prejudicial, isn't it?
Yes.
Really?
In the days following Sergeant Smith's murder, doctors Middleton and Gorrick attended ID parades, where they picked out Lawson, Siddle and Hodgson as the men they had seen on that fateful night. But was this identification evidence reliable by today's standards? The barristers are meeting with forensic psychologist Dr. Josh Davis.
Well, Josh, what we know is it was dark, it was 10 p.m. or thereabouts, it was February. Middleton was attacked by three figures. The figures are described as being tall, mid-height and short. Middleton and Gorrick basically judged, it would seem, on height and build only. What do you have to say about the reliability
both of description evidence and identification evidence in the circumstances we're discussing?
The description evidence is certainly very weak. Tall, medium, and a small guy. Plenty of people would meet those descriptions, and there's no detail, no hair colour or anything like that, which you'd normally expect if somebody got a reasonable view. I think it was dark.
Yeah.
You could hardly see anyone, silhouettes.
Right. The potential for safe identification was very limited.
I can imagine a witness. They're going to be looking for a tall man, a medium height man, and a shorter man.
Yeah.
And if the lineup, as it was put together, has only one tall man, it's almost certain that's the person you're going to identify if you haven't seen them properly in the first place.
I mean, all the indications are that there was no formal structure to the procedures.
There's no details whatsoever.
Just a load of people cobbled together.
Yes.
The problem we have in this case, we actually don't know, do we? Because we don't know what happened on these ID parades because it wasn't audited.
It's impossible to say that they were wrong, but it's quite likely it's an unreliable identification.
There was evidence that both Middleton and Gorick were under the influence of drink. At the time, they purport to have seen this group of three.
That's right.
To what extent does drink potentially jeopardise safe identification?
I think drink is one of those interesting things that has individual differences attached to it. As far as witnesses go, it's actually quite surprising. Some people are very reliable, even after having a large amount of alcohol.
Right.
Other people, less so.
Factoring into everything else we've discussed, so they'd been drinking, it was dark, it was winter, it was busy, it was nighttime. Are you confident that these were safe identifications?
No, I'm certainly not confident about it. And I don't think, reading between the lines, the witnesses themselves were confident about the identification, because they express uncertainty in their statements to the police at the time.
All right, well, thank you very much indeed, and we're really grateful to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The trial of Joseph Lowson, William Siddle and Joseph Hodgson began at the Durham Assizes on the 1st of May 1884, before Justice Sir Henry Hawkins, and lasted just 2 days. How did the defendants react to the jury's verdict? Peter and Diane have come to Clayport Library in Durham to explore some of the press coverage from the time.
Sunderland Daily Echo, Saturday, May the 3rd. The jury retired at 6:15 o'clock and did not return into court till 8 o'clock. Gentlemen, do you find the prisoner William Siddle guilty or not guilty? The foreman, guilty. Clerk, do you find the prisoner Joseph Lowson guilty or not guilty? Foreman, guilty. Clerk, do you find the prisoner Joseph Hodgson guilty or not guilty? Foreman, not guilty. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
The jury clearly felt there wasn't sufficient evidence to convict Hodgson, and he walked out of court a free man, unlike his two co-accused.
Then the prisoner Lowson said, I am innocent. There is not a man on the face of the earth who can say I touched Smith, and here my life is sworn away. His lordship, who had assumed the black cap, then proceeded, the sentence of the court upon you, William Siddle, and upon you, Joseph Lowson, is that you be hanged by the neck till you are dead, and may the Lord have mercy on your souls.
What a terrible thing to hear, isn't it, eh?
Lowson protested that he was not guilty. You will find it out when it is too late. Nothing but perjury has been spoken. I am an innocent man, lads.
And I believe that too.
Would have been awful.
He'd be devastated, wouldn't he?
His wife had just given birth.
Yeah,
and
terrible. Yeah.
that baby would never
But
know.
No, I just feel so sad by it all. The longer it goes on, the more sad I feel. You know, I know it happened a long time ago, but at the end of the day, that's my family, and I don't like it.
After his conviction, Joseph Lowson claimed that the police had stitched him up and disputed some of the key evidence they had given against him. Could there be any truth in his accusations? Jeremy and Sasha are scrutinising how the police investigation unfolded.
There are a number of very, very worrying features of the evidence that was given. Firstly, Annie Hopper
who said that she was the sister-in-law of Sergeant Daly, claimed to have been accompanying Lowson and Siddle in the cells at Staindrop. She heard them talking. She says what Lowson said to Siddle was, "They can't prove nout against us. They only have us on suspicion. Don't tell them nout." She claimed that they were effectively making up an alibi for the murder of Sergeant Smith. And then, as significantly, even perhaps more so, the evidence of William Taylor, who apparently had been a police officer for 5 days. And Lowson is supposed to have made the comment to Taylor, "I hope we haven't murdered him," which again is incriminating. Of course, this type of evidence wouldn't see the light of day in the modern world, and which, in his post-conviction statement, Lowson hotly disputed. These are very worrying matters. What do you think?
Well, I agree. And remember that this was the murder of a police officer. People in the police force, no doubt, became very emotional.
Yeah.
Feelings would have run high. Yeah. Bending the rules
Yeah.
would have been perhaps regarded as less serious in that case because they felt they were doing the right thing for their
Well, that's an important point you've
brother
raised.
officer. Yeah.
Lowson's accusations about police misconduct fell on deaf ears, and his and Siddle's execution date was set for the 27th of May. Just 3 days before, Siddle was unexpectedly reprieved and his sentence commuted to life imprisonment. But there was no such luck for Joseph Lowson. Peter and Diane want to learn more about his final hours. They're meeting with capital punishment historian Dr. Patrick Lowe at the Duncow Inn in Durham, a favourite haunt of executioners working in the nearby prison.
One of the things we read about Joseph in the papers is there's several reports where he mentions that he wants to die game. Now, this is quite an antiquated phrase by this period in time, but the idea of dying game was often associated with renowned highwaymen or people that acted with a sort of criminal bravado. Because as an expected behaviour, you were to repent and accept the justice of your sentence and prepare your soul for the afterlife. Joseph doesn't want any of that. And he's talking about the disgrace of the laws in this country and how can a man be hung. And in no uncertain terms, he's making it clear that he's not going quietly.
Patrick, I've been told and by a good source that he was a very strong man.
Yeah,
a very strong man, you know, and there was no cowering or anything like that.
Well, absolutely. That completely tallies with the reports that Joseph was jocular with the prison guards. He walks out, meets the reporters that are in the prison, says good morning, and he's smiling all the way. And he stood on the trapdoor, and what's reported in several papers we have here, and it says, on arriving at the scaffold, just before the white cap was drawn over his face, Lowson said to those around him, I wish to say that Hodgson struck the first blow, and then I helped him. I hope the Crown and country will see that Siddle gets safe home.
So despite previously protesting his innocence, on his execution day, Lowson made an apparent confession to his and Hodgson's involvement in Sergeant Smith's murder and claimed William Siddle was innocent.
I don't believe any of that, actually. I think he just went to his execution, he didn't take any rubbish, and they hung him. Now, I don't know if it's true or not.
With the judgment fast approaching, Sasha and Jeremy have come across evidence that Lowson's execution day revelation wasn't the first time this version of events had emerged. But what does this reveal about the legal advice the defendants received?
After Siddle was convicted, he wrote a letter to the Home Secretary saying that he was innocent and Hodgson and Lowson were both responsible for the attack on Sergeant Smith. Now, interestingly, after writing that letter, Lowson took it upon himself to support Siddle's account in a statement, accepting he was present and did participate in the attack. So we have to consider that, really.
We do, but Sasha, I have a related concern because what's emerged in a letter, Siddle described how he had wished to make a statement before trial. But the solicitor for the three accused, Mr. Moore, told him that any statement he made would not be believed by the police and that would bring his brother-in-law, Lowson, into it. So here was Mr. Moore advising Siddle not to make a statement. Who knows what advice Mr. Moore gave Lowson? Although, in principle, there is nothing to prevent a solicitor from representing more than one person charged in criminal proceedings. For that to have happened in a case where there was a clear conflict of interest raises all sorts of questions as to whether what the defendants said or didn't say might have been influenced by the fact they all had one lawyer. And staggeringly, what's emerged from archives recently is this note relating to a meeting between Mr. Moore and the three defendants, Siddle, Lowson and Hodgson, a couple of months before the trial.
The note suggests that in Mr. Moore's meeting with the three defendants soon after their arrest, they each gave him the same story, that Hodgson had started the attack on Sergeant Smith, Lowson had joined in, and Siddle had not been involved. Yet it appears that Mr. Moore still advised all his clients to plead not guilty.
So according to this note, which I completely agree is explosive, one solicitor represented all three men, but the person who needed separate representation more than any was Siddle himself. And instead of putting forward an explanation that he was not involved, he was pressurised into protecting Hodgson and Lowson, and the result was that Siddle was sentenced to death. So my immediate thought is that the person who's come out of this worst is poor old Siddle.
After his execution, Joseph Lowson's body was buried within the grounds of Durham Prison, so he couldn't be placed in the cemetery with his family. Peter and Diane have come to the grave of Lowson's father to reflect on the impact of Joseph's early death on his family left behind.
Richard Lowson.
Yeah, Richard Lowson.
This was a letter from Lowson before he was hanged. It is the worst job for my poor wife and children. It is to be hoped that no one would take advantage of these poor things. When I was at home...
It's all right.
I know.
It's all right. Take your time. Don't upset yourself. I was a bit weepy yesterday. That's nothing wrong in that.
Sorry.
No, you don't apologise. You've done nothing wrong.
If they destroy me, I hope you will look after my brother and sister down the lane and Bob over the stile. You can tell your father and friends that I send my best respects to them and everybody else. And the same to you and family. Yours truly, Joseph Lewison. Kiss for all. Isn't that sad?
It's dreadful.
What
Yeah.
a tragic thing.
It was a tragic thing.
It was silly and
If it was them,
all for nothing.
nothing. All for nothing.
His last thoughts were for his
His
family
family.
and his brother and sister.
Yeah.
And the little baby that had just been
Yeah.
born.
Yeah. But I'm glad I've been. I'm glad.
The barristers have completed their investigation and must now present their findings to Judge David Radford.
Well, the case against Joseph Lowson at trial largely depended on identification, and it's well documented that that can cause real problems. However, it can't be ignored that Joseph Lowson later confessed to his part in the attack.
There's a real anomaly in that all three of the accused were represented by the same lawyers, which was a recipe for disaster. There's a lot to grapple with, and I'm hoping that Judge Radford will see the strength of the arguments I put forward.
For Peter and Diane, today could finally be the day to clear their relative's name, 135 years after he was executed for murder.
It seems a very circumstantial case where two men lose their life and two walk away. You know, that doesn't smack of justice to me.
Diane, hello. Peter, nice to see you.
How are you feeling about today's events?
A little bit apprehensive. I'd like for it to come down in our favour, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd like that.
If you'd like to follow us, we'll go and see the judge.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With over 14 years' experience as a senior Crown Court judge, David Radford has presided over some of the UK's most infamous trials, and he'll be treating this case like any other.
Please take a seat. We are here today for me to consider, with the assistance of learned counsel, the safety of the conviction of Joseph Lawson of the murder of Police Sergeant Smith. Mr. Dean, would you be kind enough to address me?
Your Honour, the position in this case is that within a day or two of the incident, Dr. Middleton and Gorick, who had, on the evidence, been drinking, attended identification procedures. And albeit that the incident took place at night, in darkness, both identified the three accused. Dr. Josh Davis, who is a modern-day identification expert, he said these witnesses were effectively identifying a silhouette, and the only reliable identifying feature was a marked differential in the height between each of the three men. The picture as to the parades is murky, and my submission is that the identifications which were relied on by the prosecution were effectively worthless. The second matter is that Annie Hopper, who was the sister-in-law of the investigating officer, she gave evidence that she heard Joseph Lawson say to Siddle, quote, "They cannot prove nought against us. Do not thou tell them nought." This type of evidence simply would not emerge in the modern era. And there's a similar argument affecting the evidence of William Taylor, who apparently had served as a police officer for 5 days. Mr. Lawson was deprived of all protection in relation to these witnesses' evidence, which smack of verbal type evidence. Now, finally, Joseph Lawson had no independent representation whatsoever. Post-conviction, Siddle made a statement in the course of which he indicated that when originally seen by Mr. Moore, that he was effectively told not to make a statement for fear of implicating others. Now, if that is the sort of advice that was being given to his three clients, it means that none of them received proper independent advice. Now, this leads me in conclusion to Joseph Lawson's statement shortly before he was executed. Whilst on the one hand, it's Joseph Lawson accepting involvement in the assault upon Sergeant Smith, on the other hand, it complains that the eyewitnesses are unreliable and that some of them have committed perjury. It is a chaotic statement, clearly written by a man in fear of the gallows, and the content of it is valueless. So it's my submission that Your Honour should take the view that in this highly circumstantial case, Joseph Lawson's conviction is to be regarded as unsafe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. Yes, Miss Wass.
I accept that the identification was conducted in difficult circumstances, but both Dr. Middleton and Mr. Gorick were able to pick out Lawson at the identification parade. Of course, there was very little by way of record that was kept, but it certainly wouldn't lead to the conclusion that anything that happened at the identification parade was murky. A button was found by the body of P.C. Smith. When police searched Lawson's home, a shirt was found with a button missing. The match of that button with the shirt was significant evidence tying Lawson with the scene of the crime. The fact of blood being found on the man whose button was found at the scene together provides strong circumstantial evidence. Mr. Dean has been critical of admissions said to have been made by Lawson to P.C. Taylor and Annie Hopper, but they both suggested, if accepted by the jury, that Lawson was involved. The safety of the conviction is supported by the subsequent confession made by Lawson after trial. It is the clearest confession, and this is where the evidence of the solicitor comes into play, because we have the comfort of knowing that that was the account that Lawson gave the solicitor from the moment he was arrested. And in my submission, there is no basis for saying that the safety of the conviction is in doubt.
Thank you, Miss Wass. I'm going to reflect on both of your submissions. Would you be good enough, please, to allow me time to do just that.
You've heard our respective submissions, judges thinking about things. What are your feelings?
It doesn't seem too optimistic to me now, really. I'd like to think I was wrong, but the way it's pointing at the moment, I have some doubts.
Stay optimistic. We don't know what the outcome's going to be.
Was Joseph Lawson part of a group that brutally murdered Sergeant William Smith? Or was he fitted up by the police and subjected to an unfair trial? The judge is now ready to deliver his verdict.
Mr. Dean has drawn my attention with force to features of the identification evidence which potentially undermined its correctness and reliability. Certainly, I agree that those deficiencies which he has spoken of would today be gone through in terms by the trial judge in directions to the jury. The finding of the button by the body of the deceased police officer, which matched that torn from the shirt worn that night by Joseph Lawson, was powerful, independent, supporting evidence. I am quite properly asked to weigh the fact that it was entirely wrong for all three accused to have been represented by the same solicitor. It was clear an obvious conflict of instructions emerged from what Mr. Lawson told the solicitor, Mr. Moore, to the effect that it was he, together with co-defendant Hodgson, who had attacked Police Sergeant Smith, and that the co-accused Siddle was not participating. It was thus pellucidly clear that Mr. Siddle should have been separately represented. It was he and not Mr. Lawson who unjustly almost paid the ultimate penalty. In fact, it cannot be ignored, in my view, that after conviction and sentence, Joseph Lawson made a written statement admitting his participation in the murder. The confession was consistent with his earlier instructions to his solicitor and provided strong, independent support of the correctness of the identification evidence and the truthfulness of the evidence as to verbal admissions given. In the light of it, I am indeed satisfied that the conviction in this case was in truth a safe one. I'm going to rise.
You're obviously going to be very disappointed at that outcome.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, yes, I am disappointed. But you tried very hard.
Oh, well, that's...
You tried very hard, and I can't thank you enough.
Great to meet you anyway. Yeah, thank you very much.
We've got closure.
Disappointed, very disappointed, but I'm glad we tried. And unfortunately, the closure is not the way I would have liked it, but never mind. That's the way it works, doesn't it? We got each other, haven't we?
Yes.
And that's all that matters.